The sealed orders hit my desk at 14 minutes past the third watch, and the moment I read them, every scale on my body went cold. I had served the Galactic Concord for 30 years. I had fought in 6 campaigns across 4 sectors. I had buried soldiers and burned enemy strongholds, and stood in rooms where the fate of entire star systems was decided by committee vote. None of that prepared me for the 2 words printed at the top of the classified brief: Protocol Zenith. My name is Korath Sen. I am a commander in the Concord Peacekeeping Forces, species Vathari, born on the coastal world of Rethon Prime. I have a commendation for valor, 3 commendations for tactical excellence, and a scar across my left flank from a Krython blade that came within 2 inches of ending my career. I tell you these things not to boast, but so you understand the weight of what I am about to say. When I read those orders, my hands shook, not from the mission, not from the enemy, from the single line at the bottom of the page that read, Terran Special Operations Deployment Authorized. Liaison Officer Assigned, Commander Korath Sen. They were sending humans. The crisis on Cathara 7 had been unfolding for 19 days. A rogue warlord named Drexel Moan, a Krythion separatist with a stolen cruiser and a fanatical following, had seized the mining colony in a lightning strike that left the Concord garrison dead before they could send a distress signal. He held 3 interconnected settlement domes, 1 central reactor, an underground transit network, and 12,000 civilian hostages, drawn from 9 different species. His demands were the kind that could never be met. Full Krython independence, a sovereign battle fleet, the release of 200 convicted war criminals from Concord detention, and a deadline, 9 standard days from the moment the orders landed on my desk. What the orders did not need to tell me, because every officer on the Pale Meridian already knew, was that the Concord had already tried to resolve this 3 times. The first assault was a conventional ground attack. 600 soldiers dropped to the surface in heavy transports. Drexel had mined the landing corridor. The transports came apart before they touched soil. 412 dead in less than 40 minutes. The second attempt was a covert insertion team. 60 of our best operatives, trained in close-quarters tactics and hostage extraction. Drexel had someone inside the Concord feeding him intelligence. The team was ambushed in the transit tunnels before they reached the inner dome. All 60 were killed or captured. The bodies of those who were captured were returned to the Concord 3 days later, arranged at the colony's main airlock as a message. The third attempt was a full armored breach of the outer dome. It worked, briefly. Concord forces punched through the wall and established a foothold inside Dome Gamma. For 20 minutes, it looked like the tide had turned. Then Drexel broadcast a live feed, showing his soldiers dragging hostages to the atmospheric vents. Children, elderly, civilians who had done nothing wrong except live on the wrong colony at the wrong time. He threatened to open every vent in the colony if the assault did not withdraw within 10 minutes. The assault commander, a decorated Molvari general named Tarek Sorin, watched the feed for exactly 4 seconds before ordering the full withdrawal. Total casualties across 3 operations stood at over 2,000 dead. 2,000 soldiers sent to save 12,000 civilians, and all they had accomplished was dying. That was when the Concord Council convened an emergency session and voted on Protocol Zenith. I had heard of Protocol Zenith the way one hears of ancient weapons buried beneath holy ground. Everyone knew it existed. No one wanted to be the one to dig it up. In the 40 years since humanity joined the Galactic Concord, Protocol Zenith had been invoked only 8 times. 8 crises so severe, so beyond the capacity of any Concord military force, that the Council had no choice but to ask the humans for help. Ask, not order. No one orders humans. The protocol is a formal request, submitted through diplomatic channels, reviewed by something the humans call their Joint Special Operations Command, and either accepted or declined at their sole discretion. They had never declined, and every time they had accepted, the crisis was over within days, sometimes hours. The details were classified at the highest levels, but the outcomes were not. 8 impossible situations, 8 resolutions. The galaxy's most desperate prayers, answered by the species that most of the galaxy preferred not to think about. The vote was not unanimous. I read the transcript. Several counselors objected, not because they doubted the humans would succeed, but because they feared what human involvement meant. Counselor Ravan of the Molvari delegation said something that stayed with me. He said, "Requesting humans is not a military decision. It is a confession. It is an admission that civilization, with all its fleets and armies and alliances, has failed. And when civilization fails, Something older and more primal takes its place. That is what the humans are. They are what comes after failure. Councillor Dreth of the Ulathi delegation said nothing during the debate. When the vote was called, she simply pressed her approval and sat back. Later, a junior aide asked her why she had not spoken. Her response was recorded in the session transcript. She said, "The last time I spoke about humans in a council session, I spent 3 nights unable to sleep. I will not make that mistake again." The vote passed. 9-4. Fleet Marshal Doravan delivered my assignment personally. He is Vathari, like me, but older, harder, scaled gray with age and authority. He stood across from me in his office aboard the Pale Meridian and told me I was selected as liaison because I spoke partial Terran Standard and because I had a reputation for remaining calm under pressure. I wanted to tell him that my calm was already cracking, but I kept my mouth shut and accepted the assignment. That night, I did not sleep. Instead, I pulled every file, debrief, intelligence report, and classified assessment the Concord held on human military operations. I read for 7 hours straight, and by the end, I understood why the galaxy whispered about them the way it did. Humans do not fight like other species. Every civilization in the Concord builds its military doctrine around a core advantage. The Drenari rely on overwhelming numbers. The Mulvari use superior shielding technology. The Ulathi deploy biological weapons tailored to their enemy's physiology. The Kavari fight with engineered ferocity, chemically enhanced combat states that burn out their soldiers within minutes, but make them nearly unstoppable during those minutes. Every species has a strategy. Humans have a different approach entirely. Their core advantage is not a weapon or a technology or a numerical superiority. It is adaptability. The files described it in clinical terms. Terran operators demonstrate an unmatched capacity for improvisation under extreme stress, environmental tolerance across a broad spectrum of hostile conditions, and psychological resilience that exceeds all known baselines for sentient combat personnel. What the clinical language was trying to say, and failing, was something simpler and more frightening. Humans do not break. You can starve them, freeze them, wound them, exhaust them, terrify them, and isolate them, and they will keep fighting. Not because they do not feel pain, they feel everything. They keep fighting because something inside them refuses to stop. The after-action reports were worse than the clinical summaries. I read a Drenari account of a border skirmish where a single human squad held a mountain pass against 300 Drenari soldiers for 4 days. 4 days, 12 humans against 300. When reinforcements finally arrived, 11 of the 12 were still alive. The Drenari had lost 91. The surviving Drenari commander submitted a single-sentence report. He wrote, "We did not lose a battle. We encountered something we were not designed to fight." I read a Mulvari debrief from a hostage rescue 6 years ago. A Mulvari freighter had been seized by pirates in the outer reaches of the Tanith corridor. Human operators breached the ship, neutralized every pirate aboard, and extracted the hostages in 11 minutes. The Mulvari captain, when asked to describe the human team, said only, "They moved like water, like something that could not be held or stopped. They were already gone before we understood they had arrived." And then there was the Ulathi file. The Ulathi are a proud species, fierce, intelligent, dangerous. They have one of the most effective military forces in the Concord, built on centuries of evolutionary competition on their homeworld. They fought a territorial dispute with a human colony 16 years ago. The file on that engagement is nearly empty, not because nothing happened, but because the Ulathi refused to discuss it. The only entry is a diplomatic note from the Ulathi ambassador, submitted 3 years after the conflict. It reads, "We do not speak of the humans. We will not speak of the humans. The matter is closed." Every species in the Concord has a story like this. The details change, the ending does not. Humans arrive, the situation resolves, and whoever was on the other side of that resolution carries the memory like a scar that never fully heals. I closed the files as the station's artificial dawn began to lighten the corridors. I dressed in my duty uniform, checked my sidearm, and took the transport to Forward Staging Station Blackpoint, orbiting the outer moon of Cathara 7. The human team was already there. They had arrived during the night cycle, quiet as a rumor. I stepped off the transport and followed the station markers toward Hangar 11. The corridors were busy. Concord soldiers and support staff moved in every direction, preparing equipment, running logistics, doing the thousand small tasks that keep a military operation alive. But as I got closer to Hangar 11, the traffic thinned. Then it stopped. The last 50 meters of corridor were empty. Not just quiet. Empty, as if every soul on the station had decided, without discussion, to be somewhere else. I passed a Drenari sergeant standing at the junction. He was staring at the hangar door, with his weapon cradled against his chest. Not aimed at anything, just held close, the way a child holds a blanket. I asked him if everything was all right. He looked at me with the particular expression that Drenari make when they are afraid but will not admit it. "They are in there," he said. "The humans." He said it the way someone might say there is a fire, or the hull has been breached. Not as information, but as warning. I thanked him and kept walking. The hangar door was open. I stepped through it and into the space beyond, and for a moment, I simply stood there, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I had expected. I had expected a strike force, a company, at minimum, perhaps a full battalion, given the scale of the crisis. I had reviewed the Concorde's failed operations, 14,000 soldiers across 3 attempts, 14,000, and they had not even come close. The humans had sent 14. 14 people stood, or sat, or moved around a single stealth corvette parked at the center of the hangar. The ship was matte black, angular, and ugly in the way that things built purely for function are ugly. No decorative lines, no polished surfaces, just angles and armor, and engines designed to run silent. Stenciled on its hull in small white letters was a name that I later learned translated roughly to the Carrion Psalm. I found the name deeply unsettling, and I had not yet met the crew. A woman separated from the group and walked toward me. She was shorter than I expected, compact, hard in the way that stone is hard, not large but dense, as if her body had been compressed down to only the essential elements. A scar ran from the base of her jaw to her collarbone, a pale line against dark skin. She stopped in front of me, extended her hand and said, "Commander Sen, Captain Lena Hargrove, Terran Joint Special Operations. Welcome aboard." I took her hand. The human handshake is a ritual I had studied, but never performed. Her grip was firm enough to make the bones of my hand shift. Her eyes, brown and steady, held mine without blinking. She smiled, and the smile was genuine, and the warmth of it made me more afraid than if she had threatened me. Because I had read the files. I knew what this woman was capable of, and the gap between her warmth and her profession was a space I could not cross. She introduced me to her team. They had names and call signs and ranks, and they all blurred together in that first meeting, except for a few details that my mind snagged on and could not release. A tall man with red hair called Callahan was eating a ration bar and arguing cheerfully about a card game he had apparently lost the night before. He owed someone named Danny a bottle of something, and he was insisting that the final hand had been won through cheating. A lean woman with close-cropped black hair, Hichite, call sign Vega, was reviewing topographic scans on a portable display, marking routes through terrain that the Concorde had classified as impassable and biologically lethal. She had written a single word next to one of the routes. The word was Tuesday. A broad-shouldered operator whose call sign was Bishop was doing pull-ups from a structural beam near the Corvette's wing, counting softly under his breath. He had reached 147 and showed no sign of stopping. His movements were mechanical, effortless, like a piston cycling. A machine would have been less consistent. They were laughing, they were joking, they were eating and exercising and bickering about cards, and in less than a day, they were going to walk into a colony held by 8,000 enemy soldiers on a planet whose surface conditions would kill a Vathari in 90 seconds. I looked at them and felt, for the first time in my career, that I did not understand war at all. Captain Hargrove led me to a briefing table near the Corvette's loading ramp. The rest of the team gathered around, and the jokes stopped, not abruptly, naturally, the way a river goes quiet before it reaches a falls. One moment they were laughing, and the next they were still, and the quality of their attention was something I had never experienced before. 14 pairs of eyes locked on me with a focus that felt physical, like heat from an open flame. Every trace of humor was gone. Every muscle in every body was still. They were listening with their entire beings, not just their ears, and the intensity of it pressed against me like gravity. I presented the tactical situation, the colony layout. 3 interconnected domes, designated Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. Each dome was a sealed habitat roughly 2 kilometers in diameter, connected to the others by reinforced transit tunnels at 3 levels. The central reactor beneath Dome Alpha powered all 3. The underground transit network ran between them in a web of corridors, maintenance shafts, and cargo conduits. Drexel's estimated force composition, roughly 8,000 Krython soldiers, heavily armed, well-entrenched, supplemented by automated defense turrets along every major corridor, and a minefield around the outer perimeter that extended 300 meters in every direction. The hostage distribution. Civilians scattered across all 3 domes in groups ranging from a few dozen to several hundred, held in repurposed habitation modules under armed guard. The Dead Man protocols. Drexel had wired the reactor and the atmospheric systems to a network of switches linked to his biometrics and to manual triggers controlled by his inner circle. If his forces were overrun, if his biometrics flatlined, if unauthorized personnel breached the command level, the reactor would melt down and the atmospheric vents would open simultaneously. 12,000 hostages would die in minutes. I presented the 3 failed Concorde operations, the casualties, the intelligence leaks, the tactical errors. I held nothing back. They needed to know everything. When I finished, the team was silent for a moment. Then the questions began, and they were not the questions I expected. The Targrove asked about the colony's water recycling system, what chemicals it used, how the filtration was configured, whether the intake could be accessed from outside the domes without tripping internal sensors. She asked about the specific compounds used in the desalination process, and whether those compounds could be substituted with chemically similar alternatives that would produce different atmospheric byproducts. Callahan asked about the native soil composition on Cathara 7's surface, the mineral content, the thermal conductivity, the depth of the dust layer, and whether it would support weight or collapse under pressure. He wanted to know if the soil contained any ferromagnetic elements that could interfere with sensor equipment. Bishop asked about the indigenous fauna, specifically the thornbacks, massive burrowing creatures that lived in the rock desert outside the colony. Their migratory patterns, their nesting habits, whether they were territorial, what stimuli triggered their burrowing instinct, whether they responded to chemical signals in the soil, or vibrations, or both. Vega asked about the colony's emergency lighting, whether it ran on independent circuits, whether it could be isolated from the main power grid. She also asked about the acoustic properties of the dome interiors, how sound traveled through the curved walls, whether there were dead zones or echo chambers, and what frequency range the internal communication system operated on. A quiet operator named Nate, whose call sign I later learned was Pike, asked about the ventilation shaft diameters. Not the main shafts, the secondary ones, the maintenance crawlways that connected the atmospheric processors to the dome interiors. He wanted exact measurements, to the centimeter. He also asked about the interior surface of the shafts, whether they were smooth metal or textured composite, because the difference determined how quickly a person could move through them. I answered every question. I had prepared exhaustive briefing materials and could provide details down to the engineering specifications, but I could not see a battle plan forming from this information. They were asking about plumbing and wildlife and light switches. Where were the questions about enemy positions, weapons capabilities, defensive emplacements? I had spent hours preparing overlays of Drexel's troop deployments, and no one asked to see them. Hargrove caught my expression. She leaned toward me across the briefing table and said, "Commander, you sent 14,000 soldiers against these defenses. You fought the enemy on his terms, in his fortress, through his front door. We are not going to do that." "What are you going to do?" I asked. She looked at her team. Something passed between them. Not words, not signals, something deeper. The kind of understanding that comes from years of shared danger and absolute trust. Glances that carried the weight of entire conversations. Nods so slight they were almost invisible. Then she looked back at me and said, "We are going to make his fortress fight him for us." I did not understand what she meant. I would, soon enough. The team spent the next several hours preparing. I observed. I had been told to observe, and I am good at following orders, especially when those orders require me only to stand still and watch things I cannot explain. Callahan and another operator spent 2 hours modifying weapons I did not recognize. They were not standard Concorde issue. They were not standard human issue either. They appeared to be handmade, customized, adapted from multiple sources, and fused into something that belonged to no official inventory. The components were marked with serial numbers that had been filed off or overwritten. When I asked Callahan about one of the modifications, a cylindrical attachment on the barrel of his primary weapon, he grinned and said, "That one makes the lights go out. Not the enemy, the actual lights. Very useful when you can see in the dark and they cannot." Vega stood up from her topographic scans and walked to the hangar's secondary airlock. She cycled it open and stepped into the corridor junction beyond, a section of the station where the environmental controls were set to Cathara 7 surface conditions for testing purposes. The temperature out there was 63 degrees below zero. The atmosphere was thin and laced with silicate dust that would shred unprotected lung tissue in minutes. She stood in it for 4 minutes, breathing controlled, her body adjusting, running some internal calibration that I could not see but could feel. Then she came back, closed the airlock, and reported to Hargrove. "Manageable," she said, colder than the brief suggested. "We will want the full thermal underlayers and the supplemental hand warmers for fine motor work." Manageable. She had just stood in an environment that would have killed me in 90 seconds, and she called it manageable. Pike was lying on the hangar floor, eyes closed, breathing slowly. I thought he was sleeping until I noticed his fingers moving. He was rehearsing something. Running through a sequence of physical movements in his mind, his hands tracing shapes only he could see, turning invisible bolts, pressing invisible switches, navigating a space that existed only in his memory and his imagination. When he opened his eyes 20 minutes later, he looked at Hargrove and said, "I can fit the secondary shafts. I will need to strip the outer plate carrier and the left shoulder guard, but I can fit." I measured against the specs. 3 centimeters of clearance on each side. 3 centimeters. He was planning to crawl through a shaft with 3 centimeters of clearance on each side of his body, in the dark, in a hostile colony, with 8,000 armed soldiers above him. Bishop had stopped his pull-ups at some point, at a number I did not catch, and was now sitting cross-legged on the floor, assembling small devices I could not identify. They were about the size of a fist, with tiny speakers and projector elements, and a power cell that glowed faintly blue. He was making dozens of them, his hands moving with practiced ease, each device identical to the last. When I asked what they were, he looked up and said, "Ghosts." I did not ask him to elaborate. Something in his tone told me I would find out soon enough, and that I would not enjoy the discovery. At some point during the preparations, Hargrove sat down beside me. Not across from me as a commanding officer addressing a liaison. Beside me, as one person sitting next to another. She had a cup of something hot, a dark human beverage that smelled bitter and sharp, and she held it in both hands and blew across the surface. She asked about my homeworld, my family, how long I had served, whether I had children. She asked these questions the way she had asked about the ventilation shafts, with genuine interest, as if the answers mattered to her. I told her about Rethan Prime, the warm coastal cities built on stilts above the tidal flats. The markets where my mother used to sell woven nets, and my father sold dried reef fish. I told her about my daughter, Vesha, who was studying engineering at the Capital Academy, and who sent me messages every third day, filled with complaints about her professors, and drawings of machines she wanted to build. Vesha was brilliant and stubborn, and she had her mother's eyes and my temper, and talking about her made something in my chest loosen in a way I had not expected. Hargrove listened. She asked follow-up questions. She remembered details, circling back to things I had mentioned minutes earlier, with a precision that told me she was not making small talk. She was learning. She told me her team had a tradition of learning about the people they worked with, because, she said, it helps us remember what we are fighting for. Not strategy, not politics, people. Real people with families and homes and daughters who draw machines. I looked at her. This woman who was about to lead 13 people into a fortress held by 8,000 soldiers. This woman who had a scar on her throat and warmth in her eyes. And a ship called the Carrion Psalm. And I thought, this is why the galaxy fears them. Not because they are cruel, not because they are cold, because they are fully, completely, terribly alive, and everything they do, from the laughter to the killing, comes from the same deep well of feeling. They are not machines of war. They are people who have decided what matters to them, and that decision makes them unstoppable. The team loaded into the Carrion Psalm at 1900 hours station time. The Corvette's interior was tight, functional, stripped of everything that was not essential. 14 operators, their gear, and the particular silence that falls over soldiers who have moved past fear into something quieter and more focused. Hargrove stood at the loading ramp. She turned to me and said, "Commander, you can monitor the operation from Black Point's command center. I will give you a comm frequency. You will have limited access to our biometric feeds and positional data. You will see some of what happens, not all of it. There are things we do that do not translate to data feeds." She paused. "If it goes quiet for more than 6 hours, it means we are busy, not dead. We will call when it is done." She paused again, and her expression shifted. Something harder moved behind her eyes. The warmth was still there, but it shared space now with something older and colder, the expression of someone who has walked into dark places many times and knows exactly what it costs. "And Commander, whatever you see on your screens tonight, do not send help, no matter what. If you send Concord forces into the operational area, they will interfere with our movement patterns and they will die. Not from the enemy, from being in spaces where we are operating. Do you understand?" I told her I understood. I was not entirely sure I did. But I said it anyway, because there was no arguing with the certainty in her voice. She nodded once, turned, and walked up the ramp. The loading door closed behind her. I stood in the empty hangar and watched the Carrion Psalm detach from its moorings. It did not fly toward the colony hemisphere of Cathara 7. It flew toward the dark side, the far hemisphere, where the sun never reached, where the surface temperature plunged to lethal extremes, where the rock desert stretched for thousands of kilometers without a single structure or sign of life. 14 humans flew into the dark and disappeared. I walked to Black Point's command center and took my station. The mission clock on the main display read Zenith active. The counter began at 0 and started climbing. I watched the dark side of the world and waited for what came next. For 9 hours, nothing happened. I sat at my station in Black Point's command center, surrounded by Concord monitoring officers who had been pulled from their regular duties to support the operation. The room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when everyone in them is holding their breath. The displays showed the planet below, the colony's thermal signature glowing on the day side like a cluster of embers, and the dark side where the Carrion Psalm had landed. We had no signal from the human team, no transponder, no communications, no movement on any sensor band. They had touched down somewhere in that frozen wasteland and vanished as completely as if the planet had swallowed them. I checked the biometric feeds. Captain Hargrove had given me access to a limited telemetry stream from the team's suit systems. Heart rates, blood oxygen, core temperature, movement indicators. For the first 9 hours, I watched 14 steady heartbeats pulse across my screen. They were moving. The movement indicators showed continuous displacement at a pace that should not have been possible across that terrain. The surface of Cathara 7's dark side is broken rock, silicate dust fields, and thermal fissures that vent superheated gas without warning. Ambient temperature at the landing site was 71 degrees below zero, winds gusting to 140 kilometers per hour. Visibility near zero from the dust. The Concord's environmental database classified this terrain as non-survivable for all indexed species. Every species, including the Kavari, who evolved on an ice world and can withstand temperatures that would kill most other sentient beings. The humans were walking through it, not in vehicles, not in pressurized transports, walking, in their suits, carrying their gear, navigating by instruments, and by the kind of spatial awareness that comes from training in environments that would break most species before the training even began, moving at a steady pace across terrain that should have killed them hours ago. I watched their core temperatures hold steady. Their heart rates stayed in a range that my own species could only achieve during deep rest. They were exerting themselves at maximum physical output in a lethal environment, and their bodies were treating it like a routine patrol. A Drenari monitoring officer beside me watched the same feeds. He turned to me at one point and said, very quietly, "How are they alive out there?" I had no answer for him. I was beginning to understand that the files I had read, the clinical assessments and after-action reports and intelligence summaries, had not prepared me for the reality of what humans are. Reading about their endurance was one thing. Watching 14 heartbeats march through the dark side of a frozen world for 9 hours was another entirely. At hour 10, the first thing happened. Drexel Mohn's communication network began to glitch. It was subtle at first, a frequency dropping out for half a second, a burst of static on a command channel. Then it escalated. Random channels across the colony's internal network started broadcasting fragments of Krithan battle hymns. Not victory songs, defeat songs. The ancient chants that Krithan warriors sing when they know a battle is lost, and they are about to die. The songs played on loop for exactly 90 seconds each time, then cut to silence. 90 seconds of mourning, followed by nothing. Then a different channel would pick up a different chant, and the cycle would repeat. The monitoring officers looked at each other. I pulled up the intercepts from Drexel's command frequency. His officers were confused. They ran diagnostics on their communication systems and found nothing wrong. No malware, no external signal source, no hardware failure. The broadcasts were not coming from any identifiable source within the colony. They seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then the security cameras started flickering. Cameras in the outer corridors of Dome Gamma, the farthest dome from Drexel's command center, began showing anomalies. A shadow in a corridor that was supposed to be sealed and empty. A smudge on a wall that looked like a handprint. 5 fingers pressed against the metal in what might have been blood, or might have been dust, or might have been nothing at all. A door that was closed in one frame and open in the next, and closed again in the frame after that. Nothing definitive. Nothing you could point a weapon at. Just wrongness. Small, persistent, maddening wrongness that burrowed under the skin and stayed there. Drexel's soldiers in Dome Gamma began reporting movement in sections that thermal scans showed were empty. Patrols were dispatched. They swept the corridors with weapons raised and nerves frayed, and found nothing. They returned to their posts. 5 minutes later, another report. Movement. Sounds. Something scraping through the ventilation ducts. A whisper that might have been air circulation, or might have been a voice. More patrols. More nothing. But the nothing was worse each time, because each time the soldiers came back a little more shaken, a little less certain, a little more convinced that the empty corridors were not empty at all. I watched Drexel's command frequency as the reports stacked up. The warlord was calm for the first hour. His voice was steady, authoritative, dismissive. Equipment malfunction. Nervous soldiers, stand your ground. By hour 12, his tone had changed. He was issuing contradictory orders. Seal that section. No. Open it. Send a squad to level 4. No. Pull them back. Reinforce the junction. No. Abandon the junction. He could feel something happening inside his fortress, and he could not identify it, and the not knowing was eating at him from the inside out. He was a warlord who had taken a colony by force. He understood force. He understood combat. He did not understand this. This was something else. Something that did not follow the rules he had built his entire military career on. I realized what the humans were doing. They were not attacking the colony. Not yet. They were attacking Drexel's mind. They were reaching into his fortress with invisible fingers and plucking at his nerves, his confidence, his soldiers' morale. Every flickering camera and phantom sound was a message, delivered without words. We are here. You cannot find us. You cannot stop us. And we have not even started yet. At hour 14, the second phase began. The colony's water recycling system started producing subtly different output. I only noticed because the biometric feeds from the colony's environmental monitors, which the Concord had tapped months ago during the initial crisis response, showed a shift in the atmospheric chemistry inside the domes. Not dangerous. Not toxic. Nothing that would trip the colony's own safety alarms. Just slightly wrong. The chemical balance in the recycled air shifted enough to give the atmosphere a metallic taste, like licking a piece of old iron. Enough to make sleep difficult, the kind of subtle irritation that keeps the brain from fully relaxing into rest. Enough to create a low-grade nausea that was barely noticeable on its own, but that would compound over hours into grinding, relentless discomfort. The effect was species-specific. It targeted Krithan physiology. The hostages, drawn from 9 different species, would barely notice. But every Krithan soldier in the colony would feel it. A headache that would not fade, a tightness in the chest, a constant low-level wrongness in every breath they took. Not enough to incapacitate, just enough to erode, to weaken, to make every decision a little harder, and every hour a little longer. The humans had done something to the water recycling system, not sabotage, something more precise. They had tuned it like an instrument, adjusting the chemical output to create an environment that was technically safe, but physiologically hostile to the specific species defending the colony. It was brilliant, it was terrifying, and it was invisible. Drexel's soldiers would feel the effects without ever understanding the cause. They would blame the stress, the sleep deprivation, the strange sounds in the corridors. They would not think to blame the air. And then, the thornbacks came. The thornbacks are native to Cathara 7, massive burrowing creatures, roughly the size of a small transport vehicle, covered in overlapping plates of calcium silicate armor that can deflect vehicle-mounted weapons fire. They are not predatory. They feed on mineral deposits deep underground, chewing through rock with mandibles that generate enough force to crush starship hull plating, but they are territorial, unpredictable, and enormously destructive when agitated. A single thornback in a burrowing frenzy can undermine the foundation of a building in minutes. The colony had been built specifically to avoid their migratory routes. The settlement's location was chosen based on decades of geological survey data, showing that thornback populations did not frequent this region. But now they were here. Dozens of them, surfacing from the rock desert around Dome Gamma's foundation. Their burrowing shook the ground, sending tremors through the dome's structure that rattled equipment off shelves and set every surface humming with subsonic vibration. Their vocalizations, deep rumbles below the threshold of most species' hearing, traveled through solid rock and resonated in the bones of everyone inside the dome. Soldiers who could not hear the sound could feel it. A constant low pressure in the skull, a vibration in the teeth, a sense of wrongness that had no visible source. They were not attacking the dome. They were just there, milling around the foundation, agitated and confused, and dangerously close to the colony's structural supports. Drexel's soldiers did not know what to do with them. You cannot shoot a thornback. Their armor plating is thick enough to deflect vehicle-mounted weapons. You cannot chase them away. They do not respond to sonic deterrents or warning shots or any of the standard wildlife management protocols that the Concord recommends. They respond to geological stimuli, ground vibrations, mineral traces, subsurface chemical gradients, things that could, theoretically, be manipulated by someone who understood the creature's biology and had access to the planet's surface. I stared at the sensor data and felt a chill move through my body that had nothing to do with the station's temperature controls. The humans had herded them. They had crossed the dark side of the planet on foot, and somewhere along the way, they had done something to the ground. Laid chemical traces, created vibrations, planted mineral lures, and drawn the thornbacks out of their normal territory and toward the colony, the way a farmer herds livestock into a pen. They were using the planet's own wildlife as a weapon, not a lethal weapon, a psychological one. Another layer of pressure, another thing for Drexel's soldiers to worry about, while the real threat moved unseen through the spaces between the walls. Drexel was now fighting an enemy he could not find, in a facility where the air tasted like poison, while the ground shook beneath his feet, from creatures that could not be killed or driven away. His communications were unreliable, his soldiers were hearing ghosts, and the humans had not fired a single shot. At hour 19, I picked up the first confirmed human signature inside the colony. It appeared on a thermal scan of Dome Gamma's lower level, a heat source, faint, moving through a maintenance corridor that connected the atmospheric processors to the dome interior. It was there for 11 seconds. Then it was gone. Not faded. Gone. As if whatever had been there had simply ceased to exist. 3 minutes later, another signature appeared in Dome Beta. A different location. A different level. Separated from the first by 200 meters of sealed tunnels and security checkpoints that had not been breached. Then that one vanished too. The humans were inside the domes. They had breached the colony's perimeter without triggering a single alarm, without being detected by any sensor, without leaving a trace. I pulled up the colony schematics and tried to reconstruct their entry route. There was no viable entry route. Every external access point was sealed, mined, or monitored. The main airlocks were welded shut from the inside. The freight doors were blocked by barricades 3 meters thick. Then I looked at the secondary ventilation shafts, the maintenance crawlways that Pike had asked about during the briefing, the ones he had wanted exact measurements for, down to the centimeter, the ones that ran from the atmospheric processors on the colony's exterior, through 40 meters of rock and insulation, and into the dome interiors. The shafts were 31 centimeters in diameter. 31 centimeters. A Vathari could not fit a single arm through an opening that size. A Krython could not fit their head through it. Pike had said, "I can fit." 3 centimeters of clearance on each side. He had stripped his outer plate carrier and his left shoulder guard, reduced his profile to the absolute minimum his skeleton would allow, and crawled through 30 meters of shaft barely wider than his shoulders, in the dark, in a colony held by 8,000 enemy soldiers who would have killed him on sight if they had known he was there. And he had done it so quietly that the atmospheric processor's own vibration sensors did not register his passage. He had moved through a space that should have been physically impossible for him to occupy, and he had done it in silence. Once inside, he had opened routes for the others, disabled internal locks from the inside, overridden access panels, created entry points that did not exist on any schematic because they had been made in the last hour by human hands working in the dark. The team flowed into the colony like water seeping through cracks in stone, filling spaces that should have been impenetrable, moving through gaps that should not have existed. I watched the biometric feeds and tried to understand what I was seeing. Their heart rates were elevated but controlled. Their blood oxygen levels were stable despite the compromised atmosphere inside the domes. One operator's suit logs showed continuous movement for 21 hours without rest, 21 hours of peak physical activity in a hostile environment. My own species requires sleep every 16 hours, or cognitive function collapses irreversibly. Human literature suggests their optimal sleep cycle is around 8 hours per day. These people had been awake and operational for nearly a full planetary rotation, and their performance metrics had not declined at all. Not a fraction, not a percentage point. They were operating at the same level of precision and speed they had shown in the hangar 21 hours earlier. The hostage extraction began at hour 20. Civilians started appearing at pre-arranged extraction points on the colony's exterior. Small groups at first, 12 people at the first point, huddled in emergency pressure suits, confused and frightened, but alive and unharmed. Then larger groups, 30 at the next point, 50 at the next. The humans were moving hostages through routes that Drexel did not know existed, passages they had created or discovered during their infiltration, and depositing them outside the dome perimeter where Concord medical transports could collect them. Each extraction was timed to coincide with a distraction elsewhere in the colony. A false alarm in Dome Alpha would pull Drexel's soldiers north, while hostages were moved south through Dome Beta. A systems malfunction in the transit tunnels would draw a patrol underground, while a corridor above them emptied of civilians. A phantom heat signature on a security camera would send a squad sprinting toward a junction that contained nothing but shadows, while 60 people walked calmly out of a side corridor 2 levels below. The diversions were generated by the devices Bishop had assembled in the hangar, the ghosts. Small projectors and speakers that created phantom heat signatures, footsteps, shadows, whispered voices in empty rooms. Bishop had scattered them throughout the colony during the initial infiltration, and now they were performing, each one a tiny actor on a stage, pulling the enemy's attention in every direction, except the one that mattered. 300 hostages in the first wave, 500 in the second, 800 in the third. The pace was increasing. The humans were emptying the colony from the inside out, and Drexel did not realize the scale of what was happening. His soldiers reported scattered civilians in corridors, but civilians were always in corridors. They were hostages. They were supposed to be there. No one thought to count them. No one checked whether the groups were getting smaller. The humans understood something fundamental about the psychology of occupation. Guards stopped seeing what they expect to see. The hostages were scenery, furniture, background noise. And one by one, the humans were removing them from the picture so gently that no one noticed the frame was emptying. At hour 24, there was a firefight. It happened in a transit junction between Domes Beta and Gamma. A Krython patrol turned a corner and came face to face with Bishop and 2 other operators, escorting a group of 60 hostages. There was no time for subtlety, no time for misdirection. The corridor was 40 meters long, and there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to redirect 60 terrified civilians. Bishop stepped in front of the hostages. The 2 operators with him did the same. 3 humans between 60 civilians and a 12-soldier patrol. 3 against 12, with 60 lives behind them that could not run, could not fight, could only press against the walls and pray. The engagement lasted 9 seconds. I know this because the biometric feeds recorded the exact timestamp of every spike. Bishop fired first. His aim was precise, each shot placed not to kill but to incapacitate, striking weapon arms and legs and the joints where Krython armor was weakest. The patrol fired back. Plasma bolts filled the corridor with blinding light and the smell of superheated metal. In 9 seconds, all 12 Krython soldiers were down. 8 were alive, wounded, disarmed. 4 were not. Bishop took a plasma round through his left shoulder. His biometric data spiked. Pain indicators redlined. core temperature fluctuated wildly as his body's stress response kicked in. Heart rate jumped to a level that in my species would indicate cardiac distress and imminent system failure. His suit administered emergency coagulants, sealed the wound with a pressurized bandage that hissed as it deployed, dumped painkillers into his bloodstream through a subcutaneous injector, and Bishop shifted his weapon to his right hand and kept moving. He did not call for extraction. He did not fall back. He did not even slow down. He cleared the next 2 corridor junctions alone, one-armed, bleeding through his suit's emergency seal, to ensure the hostage route was secure, before handing the group off to another operator and continuing to the next objective. When Hargrove's voice came over the comm asking for his status, Bishop's reply was a single word. Operational. That word haunted me. It still does. Not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. A wound that would have ended a Vathari soldier's participation in any operation. A wound that our field medics would have classified as requiring immediate evacuation, was to Bishop a temporary inconvenience. He was operational. He could still hold a weapon. He could still move. He could still fight. Therefore, he would still fight. The decision was not even a decision. It was a reflex. It was who he was. By hour 28, the extraction count stood at over 9,000 hostages recovered. Drexel's garrison was falling apart. Not from casualties, though they had taken losses in scattered engagements throughout the colony. From something worse. From the slow, grinding realization that they were losing control of a situation they did not understand. Their communications were compromised. Their air tasted wrong. The ground shook. Shadows moved in empty corridors. Their hostages were disappearing. And the enemy, the force that was doing all of this, was invisible. Uncatchable. Everywhere and nowhere. Soldiers began surrendering. Not in large groups. In ones and twos. A sentry would put down his weapon and walk to an extraction point with his hands raised. A patrol would round a corner, see an empty habitation module where 200 hostages used to be held, and simply stop. Stand there. Lower their weapons. Wait to be collected. They stopped fighting because they no longer knew what they were fighting against. You can fight an army. You can fight a fleet. You cannot fight something that changes the air you breathe, and the ground beneath your feet, and takes your leverage away, one handful at a time, while you are looking in the wrong direction. One captured Crethon soldier was brought aboard a Concorde transport for debriefing. He was young, barely old enough to carry the weapon they had taken from him. He was shaking, not from cold, from something deeper. A debrief officer asked him what had happened inside the colony. The soldier stared at nothing for a long time. His eyes were focused on a distance that had nothing to do with the walls around him. Then he said, "They were everywhere. They were nowhere. We could not sleep. We could not breathe right. And every time we turned around, more hostages were just gone. It was like fighting smoke. We could not touch them. We could not see them. But they were always there. Always watching. Always moving." He paused. His hands were still shaking. "I have fought in 3 battles," he said. "Real battles. With real enemies. Enemies I could see and shoot and understand. I was never afraid until now. Because in those battles, I knew who was trying to kill me. In this one, I did not. And that is worse. That is so much worse than I can tell you." I listened to that debrief recording and thought about Hargrove sitting beside me in the hangar, asking about my daughter. I thought about Callahan arguing about cards. I thought about Vega standing in sub-zero temperatures and calling it manageable. And I thought about 14 people who had walked into the dark and dismantled an army of 8,000 without the army ever understanding how. At hour 30, Hargrove's voice came over my comm frequency, clear, calm, as if she were reporting the weather on a quiet afternoon. "Commander Sen, we are moving on the command bunker. Remaining hostages are in Drexel's direct custody. Approximately 200 civilians held in the reactor sublevel. This is the hard part." I stared at my displays. 9,000 hostages extracted. 8,000 enemy soldiers neutralized through surrender, confusion, or targeted engagement. A colony-wide defense network reduced to chaos by 14 people in 30 hours, without a single human fatality. And Hargrove called it the easy part. The hard part. She said the words with the same calm tone she used for everything, but I heard something beneath the calm that I had not heard before. Not fear, determination. The particular kind of determination that comes when you have done everything right, and the final obstacle is still standing, and you know that crossing it will cost you something you cannot get back. Drexel Mon had retreated to the colony's central reactor complex beneath Dome Alpha. He had pulled his most loyal soldiers with him, roughly 300 Krython warriors who had not surrendered, who had not broken, who believed in Drexel's cause enough to die for it. They were dug into the reactor sublevel behind blast doors, reinforced positions, and overlapping fields of fire. And they had 200 hostages with them, the last 200, the ones who could not be extracted quietly because they were held directly under Drexel's eye, in rooms adjacent to his command center, watched at every moment. The dead man switch was the real problem. Drexel had hardwired his own biometrics to the reactor's containment system. If his heart stopped, the containment field collapsed. If his blood oxygen dropped below a critical threshold, the containment field collapsed. If anyone breached the command level without his personal authorization code, the containment field collapsed. Collapse meant meltdown. Meltdown meant the reactor would go critical within 4 minutes, and everyone in the sublevel, hostages, soldiers, humans, everyone, would be dead in 6. There was no evacuation protocol that could move 200 civilians through a blast door corridor in 4 minutes. The math did not work. The dead man switch was not a threat, it was a guarantee. Drexel broadcast his final ultimatum on an open frequency. His voice was ragged. The chemical imbalance in the air had been working on him for 16 hours. He was exhausted, nauseous, and operating on the desperate energy of a man who knows he is losing, but refuses to admit it. His words came in bursts, sharp and uneven, the cadence of someone whose control is slipping and who knows it. "Meet my demands," he said, "full Krython independence. The fleet, the prisoners. You have 2 hours. Or, I take this colony and everyone in it with me. 2 hours, Concord. That is all you have." The Concord command staff on Blackpoint went silent. I could see them calculating. 2 hours. No time to negotiate meaningfully. No leverage that Drexel would accept because there was no leverage left except the hostages. And the hostages were the problem. No military option that could neutralize the dead man switch from outside the bunker. Then Hargrove spoke on the private frequency she shared with me. Her voice was steady but stripped of its usual ease. This was the operational voice. The voice that gave orders in burning buildings and breached rooms full of enemy combatants. "Commander, we are going to need that reactor's containment hardware physically bypassed. The switch is air-gapped. No remote access, no signal path. Someone has to go into the reactor chamber and install a bypass module on the primary containment relay. By hand, in person, inside the chamber." I pulled up the reactor specifications on my display. The chamber was heavily shielded but accessible through a maintenance hatch on the lower level. A hatch designed for automated repair drones, not living beings. The radiation levels inside during normal operation were significant. For my species, exposure would be fatal within 6 minutes. For most Concord species, the number was similar. 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 8 at the extreme outside. For humans, the estimates were different. The Concord's medical database estimated that a healthy human could survive inside the chamber for approximately 40 minutes before accumulating a dose that would cause severe cellular damage. 40 minutes. In a room that would kill a Vathari in 6. Hargrove continued. "Vega is going in. She has the technical training. She has rehearsed the bypass installation and simulation. She can do it." I started to object. The radiation exposure, even within the 40-minute window, would cause severe physiological damage. Cellular breakdown, organ stress, neurological effects that might not manifest for months. Even if Vega survived, and the odds were good that she would survive, she would pay for this. Her body would carry the cost for a long time, perhaps forever. Hargrove cut me off, gently but firmly. "She knows, Commander. She volunteered. She was the first to volunteer." Before I even finished explaining the situation, her hand was up. Of course she did. Of course the woman who stood in sub-zero temperatures and called it manageable volunteered to walk into a radiation chamber to save 200 strangers. Of course. Vega entered the reactor chamber at hour 31. She stripped her outer armor, because the full tactical suit was too bulky to fit through the maintenance hatch, which had been designed for drones half her width. She went in wearing a thermal underlayer and a basic radiation film that would provide minimal protection, enough to buy her extra minutes, not enough to prevent damage. She carried the bypass module in a sealed pouch strapped to her chest, and a toolkit on her belt. I watched her radiation exposure climb on the biometric feed. The numbers rose steadily. crossing thresholds that made my stomach tighten. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes. At 5 minutes, a Vathari would be dead. Vega's heart rate was elevated but controlled. Her hands were steady. The suit's fine motor sensors showed no tremor. She found the primary containment relay in the chamber's lower assembly, opened the housing, identified the circuit paths that connected Drexel's deadman switch to the containment field generators, and she began installing the bypass, rerouting the containment field's power supply through the bypass module, so that even if the switch triggered, the field would maintain itself on independent power. The work was delicate, precise. One wrong connection and the relay would trip, sending an alert to Drexel's monitoring systems and giving him time to trigger the switch manually before the bypass was complete. She worked for 31 minutes. 31 minutes in a room that was slowly killing her. Her biometric data told the story that her steady hands would not. Radiation markers climbing. Cellular stress indicators rising across every monitored system. White blood cell count spiking as her immune system recognized the assault and mobilized everything it had. Nausea building. Core temperature rising as her body fought to repair damage faster than it accumulated. She completed the installation at minute 31, tested the bypass, confirmed the containment field was now running on independent power. Then she crawled back through the maintenance hatch and emerged into the corridor. She was shaking. Her skin was flushed a deep red beneath the radiation film. The biometric feed showed the early stages of radiation sickness in full bloom. Nausea, elevated white blood cell count, cellular stress markers spiking across every monitored system. Her body was fighting a war on a microscopic level, and it was losing ground with every passing minute. She gave a thumbs up. Then she sat down against the corridor wall, pulled a medical kit from her belt, and began administering her own treatment with hands that trembled but did not falter. Anti-radiation compounds, cellular repair accelerants, stabilizers for her immune system, things that would mitigate the damage but not eliminate it. She would survive, she would recover. But the cost was written in her cells and would be felt for months, perhaps longer. With the dead man's switch neutralized, Hargrove moved. The breach happened fast, faster than I could track on the displays, faster than the monitoring officers could update their situation boards. Hargrove split her remaining operators into 3 elements. Element 1 hit the blast doors with shaped breaching charges that cut through 40 centimeters of reinforced alloy in 2 seconds flat. Element 2 entered through the ventilation system on the level above and dropped down through maintenance shafts that opened directly into the sublevel's secondary corridors. Element 3, led by Callahan, used the transit tunnels to access the sublevel from below, emerging through a floor grate that Drexel's engineers had bolted shut and that Callahan opened with a pry bar and raw strength in less than 4 seconds. 3 entry points, 3 simultaneous breaches, 300 defenders who suddenly found themselves fighting in 3 directions at once, in a space they thought had only one entrance. The audio feed was chaos. Gunfire, concussion blasts, Krython soldiers screaming orders that no one could hear over the noise. Human voices cutting through the cacophony, short, clipped, professional, calling positions and targets, with the precise language of people who have done this so many times that the words come without thought. Hargrove, moving through the command-level corridor, calling contacts and clearing rooms with a rhythm that sounded almost musical in its precision. Left clear, right clear, moving. 2 contacts, 12 o'clock, engaging. Clear, moving. Callahan, somewhere in the ventilation system above, dropping through a ceiling panel into a room full of enemy soldiers, and engaging 3 of them before his feet hit the ground. The audio caught his voice, calm, almost conversational, calling his kills and moving to the next target with the unhurried efficiency of a man doing a job he knows by heart. Pike, emerging from a maintenance shaft behind a Krython barricade, neutralizing the position from the rear before the defenders understood what had happened. His voice on the comm was the quietest of all, barely above a whisper, giving coordinates and confirmations in a tone that suggested he was discussing the weather. The fighting in the sublevel lasted 11 minutes, 300 Krython soldiers against 12 human operators. When it was over, 267 Krython soldiers were down, wounded, incapacitated, disarmed. The remaining 33 surrendered when they realized that the people they were fighting could not be stopped by barricades or numbers or anything else they had. The hostages were alive, all 200 of them. Frightened, shaking, some of them injured in the crossfire, but alive. Every single one. Drexel Moan was taken alive. Hargrove's team found him in his command room, standing at the manual override panel, reaching for the trigger that would have overridden the bypass and detonated the reactor. His hand was on the panel. His finger was moving toward the switch. He was half a second from pressing it when Callahan put a stun round into his chest from 6 meters away. Drexel went down hard, and 2 operators secured him before consciousness returned. They bound his hands, neutralized his access to the override, and carried him out of the command room. They wanted him alive, for intelligence, for justice, for the message that capturing a warlord sends versus killing one. Killing would have been easier, safer, less risk to the team. They chose the harder path because it was the right one, and because humans, I was learning, always choose the harder path when the harder path is the more just one. I broke protocol. I could not stay on the station any longer. I could not sit in a chair and watch data feeds while the reality of what had happened existed only as numbers on a screen. I commandeered a shuttle, gave the deck officer my authorization code, and flew down to the colony's surface before anyone could tell me not to. I landed at the main landing pad as the medical evacuation transports were arriving. The colony was still, the fighting was over. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace, but the silence of aftermath, the kind of quiet that settles over a place where something enormous has happened, and the air itself has not yet recovered. Concord medical teams were processing freed hostages, checking vitals, distributing supplies. Krython prisoners were being collected and restrained. Everywhere I looked, there was order emerging from chaos. But it was a fragile order, held together by exhausted hands and raw adrenaline. I walked through the corridors of Dome Gamma. Every engagement site I passed told the same story: controlled fire, precise angles, minimal collateral damage. The walls were scarred with plasma burns, but the scars were clustered, deliberate, targeted. No wild spray patterns, no structural damage to load-bearing walls, no signs of explosive overuse. The humans had not fought through this colony. They had performed surgery on it. Every shot had a purpose. Every tactical decision had been calibrated to minimize harm to the structure and the civilians within it. The corridor floors were littered with disabled weapons and unconscious soldiers, not bodies. Wherever possible, the humans had used non-lethal force: stun rounds, restraints, incapacitants. They killed when they had to, and only when they had to. And I could see the difference in every room I entered. The rooms where killing had been necessary were clean, quick, no suffering. The rooms where non-lethal options were available showed soldiers restrained, disarmed, sometimes bandaged. The humans had made the choice to preserve life, even when taking it would have been faster and safer for themselves. Then I saw something that broke my understanding of war completely. In a medical station near the transit junction where Bishop had fought, human operators were treating wounded Krython soldiers. Not hostages, not allies, the enemy. The same soldiers who had held 12,000 civilians at gunpoint, who had killed Concord troops, who had served a warlord with blood on his hands. The humans were binding their wounds, administering painkillers, checking vital signs. One operator was speaking to a Krython prisoner, in halting, accented Krython, stumbling over the consonant clusters that make the language difficult for human mouths. He was telling the prisoner that the wound was not serious, that he would be transferred to a Concord medical facility, that he would receive proper treatment and clean food and a warm place to sleep. The Krython soldier stared at the human with an expression I recognized because I had worn it myself. It was the look of someone whose understanding of the universe has just shifted beneath them, like unstable ground. He had been taught that his enemies were monsters, and here was his enemy, bandaging his arm and speaking his language badly but earnestly, and telling him he was going to be all right. I found the human team in a maintenance bay near the reactor sublevel. They were gathered in a loose circle, standing or kneeling or leaning against walls, and the silence around them was different from the silence elsewhere in the colony. It was heavier, thicker. It pressed against my chest when I walked into the room and made it hard to draw a full breath. Pike was dead. He had been killed during the bunker breach. The details came to me later, in fragments from the after-action report, and from quiet conversations with team members who spoke about it only reluctantly, only when pressed, and only in short sentences that left more unsaid than spoken. Pike had been the first through the maintenance shaft into the sublevel. He emerged into a room where Drexel's soldiers had positioned hostages as human shields, civilians held at gunpoint, in a semicircle around the main corridor intersection. When the breach happened, and the blast doors blew inward, and the fighting erupted in 3 directions at once, Two of the Krython soldiers panicked. They turned their weapons not on the attacking humans, but on the hostages. Two children, a brother and sister from a Mulvari mining family, were directly in the line of fire. Pike saw them. He saw the weapons turning. He saw the fingers on the triggers. And he moved. He put himself between the children and the plasma bolts. His body absorbed the hits that would have killed them. 2 rounds, center mass, through his chest plate and into the vital structures beneath. Both children survived without a scratch. They would not know his name. They would not know what he had done for them until they were much older, if they were ever told at all. They would only know that in the worst moment of their lives, in the fire and the noise and the screaming, something had shielded them. Something warm and solid and human had placed itself between them and death and refused to move. When I entered the maintenance bay, the team was standing around his body. Hargrove was kneeling beside him, one hand resting on his chest. Her eyes were closed. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Callahan stood behind her, his hands clenched at his sides, his jaw set so tight, the muscles in his neck stood out like cables. Bishop was there, his wounded shoulder wrapped in a field dressing that was already soaked through, his good hand resting on Pike's boot. Vega was there too, pale and shaking from the radiation, leaning against the wall for support, but present. They were all present, every one of them. No one spoke, no one moved. The only sound was breathing, slow, uneven, the breathing of people who are holding grief inside their bodies, because there is no room to let it out. Not yet. Not here. There would be time for that later, in private, in the dark hours when the mission was over, and the adrenaline had burned away, and there was nothing left but the empty space where a friend used to be. I stood at the edge of the room and watched these people, these impossible, terrifying, beautiful people, and I saw the thing that the intelligence files and the after-action reports and the clinical assessments could never capture. I saw the other side of their ferocity, the side that was not about strength or endurance or tactical genius. The side that was about love. They loved each other. Fiercely, completely, without reservation. And they loved the people they protected, with the same depth, the same intensity, the same willingness to pay the ultimate price. Pike had thrown himself between 2 children and a plasma bolt, because in that fraction of a second, there was no calculation, no hesitation, no weighing of odds. There was only a man who saw children in danger and did the only thing his heart would allow him to do. They were not terrifying because they were cold. They were terrifying because they burned. Because everything they did, the planning, the endurance, the killing, the mercy, came from a fire inside them that did not go out. Could not go out. That fire was the thing the galaxy felt when it whispered about humans in quiet voices. The thing the Drenari sensed in their mountain pass. The thing the Ulathi refused to speak of. It was not violence. It was not bloodlust. It was conviction. It was the absolute, unshakable belief that some things are worth any price. And the willingness to pay that price, in full, without complaint, without hesitation, without looking back. Hargrove stood. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at me, and her eyes were red but steady. Her voice did not waver. The grief was there, visible, present, undeniable. But it did not break her. Nothing could break her. That was the point. "We need a transport for our man," she said. "He goes home." I arranged the transport without hesitation. I had no words to offer, no comfort that would be adequate. But I could do this one thing. I could make sure that Pike went home. The Concord Council convened a full session 3 days later. I was summoned to deliver the operational report. I stood at the center of the chamber, surrounded by the tiered seats of 400 species delegations, and I told them what had happened on Cathara 7. I presented the numbers. 14 human operators deployed. 1 stealth corvette. Total operation time, 34 hours. 12,000 hostages recovered. 1 human killed in action. Enemy force of 8,000 neutralized through a combination of psychological operations, environmental manipulation, precision engagement, and the systematic dismantling of the enemy's will to fight. The numbers were staggering, but numbers were not why the council had summoned me. They wanted to understand what the numbers meant. They wanted me to translate the data into something they could process, categorize, file away in a diplomatic folder, and reference during future strategic discussions. They wanted me to make it manageable. I could not do that, not honestly. I told them about the dark side crossing. 14 humans walking through lethal cold for 9 hours, without slowing, without faltering, without complaint. I told them about the water recycling adjustment that turned the colony's own atmosphere against its defenders, without harming a single hostage. I told them about the thornbacks herded across the planet's surface, to shake the foundations of the enemy's fortress. I told them about Pike crawling through a 31-centimeter shaft to open the colony from the inside. I told them about Bishop taking a plasma round through his shoulder and clearing 2 more corridors one-handed, without requesting medical aid. I told them about Vega walking into a radiation chamber, knowing what it would cost her body, and completing her task with steady hands. The council listened in silence. 400 species, thousands of delegates, not a sound. When I finished the tactical summary, Councillor Ravan of the Mulvari delegation, the same delegate who had spoken against Protocol Zenith in the original vote, who had called the humans what comes after failure, raised his hand. "Commander Sen," he said, "in your professional military assessment, based on what you have observed and documented, should the Concord fear humanity?" The question hung in the air of the chamber like a held breath. I felt every eye on me. Every delegate, every aide, every observer in the gallery above. They all wanted the same answer. They wanted me to tell them that humans were dangerous but containable, fearsome but predictable, a weapon that could be pointed and controlled and understood within the existing frameworks of Concord military and diplomatic doctrine. I could not tell them that, not honestly, not after what I had seen. I took a long moment. I looked at the faces around me. Species that had built civilizations spanning star systems. Species that had mastered technologies beyond my comprehension. Species that had fought wars and negotiated treaties, and shaped the galaxy according to their ambitions for millennia. They were powerful. They were advanced. They were afraid. And I told them about Hargrove asking about my daughter. I told them about the human team laughing and joking before a mission that should have terrified them. I told them about Callahan arguing about a card game. I told them about the operators treating wounded enemy soldiers in the aftermath, speaking the enemy's language, binding the enemy's wounds with the same care they would show their own. I told them about the circle of silence in the maintenance bay, where 13 people stood around the body of the 14th and grieved with a depth of feeling that made the air vibrate. I said, "Counselors, you ask if we should fear humanity. The answer is that the question misunderstands what humanity is. Humans are not weapons. They are not monsters. They are not the savages that some of our intelligence assessments suggest, or the cold killing machines that our threat analyses describe. They are people. Fully, completely, terribly alive. They feel everything. Pain, joy, grief, love, rage, tenderness, fear, hope. They feel it all, and they feel it deeper than any species I have ever encountered in 30 years of service, across 4 sectors of Concord space. And that feeling is the source of everything they do. Their laughter and their killing come from the same place. Their mercy and their ferocity are the same thing, seen from different angles. When a human decides that something matters, when they choose to protect a stranger, or fight for an ideal, or stand beside a comrade, that decision becomes the center of their universe. Everything else, fear, pain, exhaustion, the odds against them, the certainty of their own death, becomes secondary, not ignored. They feel all of it, but they carry it. They carry it and they keep moving. I paused. The chamber was so quiet I could hear the ventilation systems cycling air through the ducts above the gallery. "You cannot deter that with threats," I said. "You cannot outmaneuver it with tactics. You cannot overwhelm it with numbers. The only defense against humanity is to never give them a reason to come for you. Because once they have a reason, once they have decided that you are the thing standing between them and whatever they have chosen to protect, then nothing in this galaxy will stop them. Nothing. They will walk through fire and ice and radiation and bullets and the absolute certainty of their own death, and they will not stop until it is done or they are gone. And even then, even if you stop one, the others will not break. They will grieve, they will hurt, and then they will come for you harder. Should we fear them? No. We should understand them. We should understand that they are the most dangerous thing in this galaxy, not because of what they can do, but because of why they do it. They fight because they care. They endure because they love, and they will never, ever give up on the people they have chosen to protect. That is what makes them special forces. Not the training, though their training exceeds anything in our doctrinal experience. Not the endurance, though their endurance defies our biological models. Not the technology, though their technology is formidable. It is the fire. The unbreakable, unquenchable fire that burns at the center of every single one of them. I stepped back from the podium. The silence held for a long time. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what I had said settled over the chamber like a physical force, and I could see it landing differently on every face. Some delegates looked relieved. Some looked more afraid than before. Some looked thoughtful, as if they were rearranging everything they knew about the galaxy to accommodate this new understanding. The Ulathi delegate, Councillor Dreth, sat motionless in her seat. Her expression was unreadable. But her eyes, when they met mine, held something that might have been gratitude. Later, after the session ended, and the delegates filed out in quiet groups of 2 and 3 and 4, murmuring to each other in languages I did not speak, I found Hargrove on Blackpoint's observation deck. She was alone. The planet Cathara 7 turned below, its colony lights flickering back to life as repair teams restored power grid by grid. The domes glowed softly against the dark surface of the world, 3 small clusters of warmth in an ocean of cold stone. She did not turn when I entered. She knew it was me. I do not know how. Perhaps she recognized my footfall. Perhaps she felt the change in the air. Perhaps she simply knew. The way soldiers know when a familiar presence enters a room, not through any single sense, but through all of them at once. I stood beside her and looked at the planet, and did not speak for a long time. The silence between us was comfortable, not empty, full of shared experience and mutual understanding, and the particular bond that forms between people who have witnessed something together that words cannot fully contain. Then I said, "Your council has asked me to assess what happened here. I have delivered my report. But I need to understand something for myself, something the report could not capture." She waited, patient, still. "Why?" I said. "Why did you come? Why do 14 people risk everything for 12,000 strangers of species they have never met, on a world they have never visited, in a conflict that is not theirs? You owe us nothing. We are not your people. We are not your allies, not in any meaningful sense. We are species that whisper about you in fear and pass around intelligence reports describing you as threats. Why would you die for us?" Hargrove was quiet for a long time. She watched the planet turn. The colony lights grew brighter as more systems came online, and the pattern of them reminded me, just for a moment, of the tidal markets on Raython Prime, the strings of lanterns that my mother used to hang above her stall when the evening markets opened, and the air smelled of salt and woven rope. When Hargrove spoke, her voice was low, and it carried a weight that I have never heard in any voice before or since. "Because somewhere in that colony," she said, "someone was sitting in the dark, a child maybe, or someone's parent, or just a person who had done nothing wrong, who had been living their life and going to work and hoping for the future, and then one day armed men broke through the door and took everything away from them, and that person was sitting in the dark, alone, and they were afraid, and they were hoping that someone, somewhere, was coming to help." She looked at me. Her eyes were clear. "We made a decision a long time ago, Commander, as a species, as a people, not in a council chamber or a military briefing room. In the quiet places, in the moments when someone is hurting and someone else chooses to stand up, we decided that we would be the ones who come. Not because we are stronger than everyone else, not because we are braver, because we know what it feels like to sit in the dark and hope. Every human knows. It is woven into our history, our stories, our blood. We have been the ones in the dark. We have been the ones who waited and hoped and prayed that help was coming, and we decided that no one else would stay there if we could reach them. Not if we could help. Not ever." She turned back to the planet. "That is why Pike is dead," she said softly. "Because he saw 2 children in the dark, and he refused to let them stay there. He did not think about it. He did not weigh the cost. He saw them, and he moved. Because that is what we do. That is all we do. We move toward the people who need us, and we do not stop until we reach them." I stood beside her for a long time after that. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say. The planet turned below us, and the colony lights grew brighter, and somewhere in those domes, 12,000 people were breathing free air and holding each other and beginning the long, slow process of rebuilding their lives. News of the Cathara 7 operation spread through conquered space in the weeks that followed. It spread the way all human stories spread, not as official reports or diplomatic communiques, but as whispers. Soldiers telling soldiers in mess halls and barracks. Diplomats murmuring over drinks at embassy functions. merchants exchanging rumors at trading posts on the edges of mapped space. The story grew with each telling, as stories do, but the core of it remained the same. 14 humans, 8,000 enemies, 12,000 saved. Every species processed it differently. The Drenari, who had already classified humans as an extreme threat based on the Mountain Pass incident 16 years ago, updated their assessment. They struck the word extreme and replaced it with incalculable. Their military command issued a standing directive that no Drenari force was to engage human operators under any circumstances without explicit authorization from the High Marshal personally. The directive was not classified. It was distributed openly to every officer in the Drenari fleet, because the Drenari wanted their people to understand the seriousness of the order. The Molvari sent a diplomatic envoy to Earth within the month. They requested a formal non-aggression pact, not because they feared a human attack. They had no reason to believe humans would ever attack them, because they wanted the reassurance of knowing, in writing, on record, that they would never find themselves on the wrong side of a Protocol Zenith deployment. The treaty was signed within 6 weeks. 3 species that had been quietly positioning forces along Concord border worlds, testing the edges of Concord authority with probing raids and diplomatic provocations, stood down without announcement. Their fleets withdrew to home territory. Their aggressive posturing softened overnight. Their ambassadors began speaking of cooperation and mutual benefit, where weeks before they had spoken of sovereignty and unilateral action. No official reason was given for the change in posture. None was needed. Everyone knew. The Ulithi representative, Councillor Dreth, when asked by a journalist for comment on the Cathara 7 operation, delivered a statement that was the longest official Ulithi comment on humans in 16 years. It consisted of 5 words. Now you understand our silence. 6 months after Cathara 7, I received a reassignment. Fleet Marshal Dorovan called me into his office and told me that the Concord was establishing a new program, the Terran Joint Operations Liaison Initiative. Its purpose was to train Concord officers in the principles and practices of working alongside human special forces teams, to bridge the gap between Concord military doctrine and the human approach to warfare, to ensure that the next time Protocol Zenith was invoked, the liaison officer would be prepared for what they were about to witness. Dorovan told me I was the obvious choice to run the program. I was the foremost non-human expert on Terran military operations in the Concord. I was the only officer who had observed a Protocol Zenith deployment from start to finish and survived with my sanity intact. His word, not mine. I was not entirely sure about the intact part. I accepted, not because I wanted a promotion or a title or a position of authority, because I wanted what I had learned on Cathara 7 to mean something beyond a classified report and a council briefing, because I wanted every officer who might one day stand where I stood to understand what they were dealing with. Not the threat assessments, not the clinical analyses, not the numbers, the truth. Every new class of liaison officers sits before me on their first day. They are nervous. Some are excited, some are terrified. They have read the files, they have heard the legends. They think they know what humans are. They do not. I tell them. I tell them about the dark side crossing, and the water system, and the thornbacks, and the ghosts. I tell them about Bishop's shoulder and Vega's radiation chamber, and Pike's last seconds on a cold floor in a maintenance bay, where 13 people stood in silence and said goodbye. I tell them about laughter before a mission, and grief after one. I tell them about a captain who asked about my daughter, and a team that treated wounded enemies with the same care they showed wounded friends. And at the end, I tell them the thing that matters most. You have read the files, I say. You have heard the legends. You think you understand what humans are. You do not. I have stood beside them. I have watched them fight, bleed, grieve, and laugh. Here is what I know. Humans do not conquer worlds. They do not seek empires. They do not wage war for glory or territory or pride. They fight for each other. They fight for strangers. They fight for anyone who has been left in the dark and forgotten. That is what makes them unstoppable. Not their endurance, though it will outlast yours. Not their adaptability, though it will outmatch yours. Not their ferocity in combat, though it will terrify you down to the marrow of your bones. It is their purpose. A human with a reason to fight is the most dangerous thing this galaxy has ever produced. And a human who has chosen to protect you is the most valuable ally you will ever have. The Concord calls them special forces. The galaxy prays never to face them, but the real prayer, The one you should carry with you every day of your service, every mission, every deployment, every moment you stand at the edge of something terrible and wonder if you will survive it. The real prayer is simpler than that. Pray that when the darkness comes, they are standing beside you. I dismiss the class. They file out quietly, each of them carrying something they did not have when they walked in. Not knowledge, not data, understanding. The beginning of understanding, at least. The rest will come with time and experience, and, if they are fortunate, with standing beside humans and seeing for themselves. I return to my office. I sit down at my desk and look at the small object I keep on the corner, beside my commendation medals and the photograph of my daughter. It is a patch, a human military patch, black fabric with a white emblem, worn and slightly frayed at the edges. Hargrove pressed it into my hand on the day her team departed Black Point. She closed my fingers around it and said, "You are one of us now, Commander, whether you like it or not." I kept it. I keep it still. Some days I pick it up and turn it over in my hands and think about the weight of what it represents. Not a unit, or a rank, or a military tradition. A promise. A promise that somewhere in the galaxy, there are people who will not let the darkness win. Who will walk through anything, endure anything, sacrifice anything, to reach the people who need them. Not for payment, not for glory, not for empire. Because it is right, because someone is in the dark, because help should always come. Today there is a new briefing on my desk. Another crisis. Another impossible situation. Another world teetering on the edge of catastrophe. Another population trapped between hostile forces and an indifferent vacuum. Another set of numbers that add up to despair. I read through the details and feel the familiar tightness in my chest. The old knot of fear and responsibility that comes with knowing that lives hang in the balance, and that the margin between salvation and catastrophe is thinner than a blade. Then I reach the final line of the briefing, and the knot loosens. Just a fraction, just enough to breathe. The final line reads, "Terran Special Operations has been notified. Team en route." I close the file. I lean back in my chair, and I allow myself to breathe. Help is coming. It always does. Somewhere out there, in the black space between stars, a small ship with a grim name is cutting through the void. Inside it, a team of people who laugh too loud and care too deeply and refuse to quit are checking their gear and asking strange questions and making jokes about card games they lost last week. They are afraid. They are always afraid. They do it anyway. They carry the fear inside them like fuel, and they burn it as they move, and the burning keeps them warm in the coldest places the universe can offer. The galaxy calls them special forces. The galaxy prays never to face them, and somewhere in the dark, on a world that is falling apart, someone is waiting. Someone is hoping. Someone is sitting in a cold room with their arms around their children, listening to the sounds of danger drawing closer, and they are believing, against all evidence, against all reason, against the weight of a universe that does not care, that help will come. It will. It always will. Because that is what humans do.